The Killer Bee True Crime Series, Episode 7, Part 1, The BTK Killer. Due to the graphic nature of this killer's crimes, listener discretion is advised. This episode includes discussions of murder and assault that some people might find offensive. On October 21st, 1974, a reporter named Don Granger received a mysterious phone call at the offices of the Wichita Eagle. The raspy voice on the other end of the line claimed that he had information about the Otero family murders. Quote, "There's a letter about the Otero case in a book at the public library," end quote. Granger called the police and quickly searched the public library. In a book titled Applied Engineering and Mechanics, they found a typo-riddled letter that appeared to be from the murderer. It read, "It's hard to control myself. You'll probably call me a psychotic with a sexual perversion hang-up. Where this monster entered my brain, I will never know, but it's here to stay. How does one tear himself? If you ask for help, that you have killed 4 people, they'll laugh or hit the panic button, call the cops. I can't stop it, so the monster goes on and hurts me as well as society. It's a big, complicated game, my friend. The monster plays, putting victims' numbers down, following them, checking up on them, waiting in the dark, waiting. The pressure is great, and sometimes he runs the game to his liking. Maybe you can stop him. I can't. He's already chosen his next victim, or victims. Good luck hunting. Truly yours. Guiltily." End quote. The letter was chilling, and the killer's postscript promised more horrors to come. He wrote, "P.S. Since sex criminals do not change their MO, or by nature cannot do so, I will not change mine. The code words for me will be bind them, torture them, kill them. BTK." Dennis Radar murdered 10 victims in Wichita, Kansas, over a period of 2 decades, from 1974 to 1991. He killed to satisfy his disturbing sexual fantasies of strangling and torturing helpless women. He also longed for media attention. Starting in 1974, he spent 3 decades sending mocking letters to the press. He also maintained a double life as a loving family man, scoutmaster, and church leader. None of his colleagues or family members suspected him of being a sadistic killer. Jeffrey Davis, the son of one of the Raiders' victims, describes how Raider hid his murders behind a facade of normalcy. Quote, "He looks like us. He talks like us. He goes to the same grocery store. He goes to church. Evil exists in many forms, and that's the most classic case of evil I've ever seen. In what limited law enforcement experience I've got, and what mental health counseling experience, none of the others put together can equal him. I'm serious. He is absolutely off the scale. It's scary." End quote. Rader's thirst for media attention eventually proved to be his downfall. In 2004, he began sending cryptic clues and evidence of his murders to local newspapers and television stations in Wichita. Rader's own letters allowed police finally to arrest him and deliver a measure of justice to his 10 victims. Rader's parents had no idea their firstborn son would grow up to be a killer. His mother, Dorothea May Cook, and his father, William Elvin Rader, began dating as teens. They got married in 1943. Dorothea was still a senior at her Kansas high school. William Rader joined the Marines and spent World War II fighting on the Pacific Front. After the war, William and Dorothea moved next door to Dorothea's parents on a farm in Columbus, Kansas. Dorothea soon became pregnant with their first son, Dennis. But when she was pregnant, she suffered a terrible fall off of a horse. Rader later wondered if his mother's fall during pregnancy contributed to his murderous tendencies, which he nicknamed Factor X. In 2013, Dr. Tala Nasrallah, out of the Sudan, found that seemingly insignificant blunt force trauma injuries can cause lasting damage to a developing fetus, particularly if the pregnant mother is injured in the 2nd or 3rd trimester. It's certainly possible that Rader suffered a head injury while he was in the womb due to his mother's fall, and that it negatively impacted his development. And that wasn't the only head injury Rader had suffered. Rader was born on March 9, 1945. In the fall of that year, when Rader was about 6 months old, his mother dropped him. He allegedly banged the right side of his head so badly that he turned blue, but he never saw a doctor. Rader later discussed the incident with Catherine Ramsland, a psychology professor who wrote a biography on the killer. He mentioned that the drop might have scrambled his network, and it is true, scientists have found a link between certain types of brain lesions and criminal behavior. A study published in the National Academy of Sciences Journal in December 2017 found that injuries to the area of the brain responsible for moral decision-making were associated with increased criminal behavior. According to that study, these brain injuries could even be the reason that previously law-abiding citizens turned to crime. If Rader suffered a brain injury, either in utero or as an infant, this could have been one of the reasons why he went down what he calls the dark path, his road to murder. However, it's important to note that Rader, like many serial killers, also have a tendency to lie and make exaggerations, so you have to take his claims with a grain of salt. Rader enjoyed his early years living next door to his maternal grandparents. His grandfather owned a combo barbershop and pool hall. Rader felt his grandfather was amicable, but was also convinced his grandfather had a dark side to his personality. According to Rader, his grandmother wasn't very warm either. She often seemed as though she was lost in her own thoughts, or imagining herself somewhere else. Rader later wondered if he'd inherited his tendency to compartmentalize different aspects of his life from his grandmother. Rader's ability to compartmentalize his murderous side is what allowed him to lead a double life for decades, and eventually raise a family that had no idea he was a killer. According to Dr. Marissa Beretta, a licensed social worker, compartmentalizing is a technique everyone uses to some degree in order to stay mentally healthy. For example, mentally separating your work life and your home life is a normal type of compartmentalizing, but Rader used his compartmentalization to hide his sadistic desires from everyone around him. Author's note: compartmentalizing is very common in first responders. It allows first responders to see nightmares at work and then come home and try to be normal parents hours later. It can also lead to PTSD. The seeds of Rader's disturbed fantasies were planted at an early age. At around age 3 or 4, he became terrified of monsters and imagined them everywhere. He saw monsters all over his home, including on the walls, the floors, the interplay of light and shadows. Rader later speculated that his fear of monsters surrounding him was connected to his desire to kill. Perhaps murder was his way of coping with feeling afraid and vulnerable. From a young age, Rader was also oddly aroused by his own fear of monsters. He remembered that any time that he saw a monster, quote, "For some reason, I get a tightness in my crotch," end quote. This could have been the beginnings of Rader's paraphilia. Paraphilia is an intense attraction to abnormal scenarios and fantasies. At a very young age, Rader was aroused by imagining frightening scenarios wherein he was helpless as monsters hunted him down. This connection in Rader's mind between helplessness and arousal was further cemented through an incident that occurred when he was about 4 years old. His mother, Dorothea, was searching under the couch cushions for something that got her wedding ring caught in the couch springs. She couldn't free her hand and soon became frantic. She cried and begged her young son to run next door and get his grandmother. Rader's reaction to his mother's distress was apparent, to say the least. He remembered, quote, "I was scared, yet excited. I stared at her. I had a strange feeling at the pit of my stomach and in my groin. I ran next door to my grandma's house for help. I often wonder if the early emotions of this triggered some inner dark feeling about women in bondage needing help," end quote. Around 1949, Rader's family moved from Columbus to Wichita, Kansas's biggest city. The family started out downtown, then they moved to a 2-bedroom house. It had a yard and a chicken coop that fascinated Rader, and he loved watching his parents and grandparents tie up the chickens in the coop for slaughter. The chickens' inability to free themselves sexually excited him, and he enjoyed the animals' torment, watching them struggle in the moments before they were beheaded. Already as a young child, Rader was developing a type of paraphilia, someone who is sexually excited by murder. For Rader, pleasure and pain were intermingled. He vividly recalls suffering an earache when he was somewhere between the ages of 5 and 7. He remembered his mother pinning him down while a female doctor punctured his ear to help the ear drain the infection. Rader believed this incident contributed to his fondness for bondage and tying up his victims. Rader started first grade in 1951. He struggled academically and socially. He was withdrawn and didn't make friends easily. Instead, Rader became increasingly obsessed with horror movies, a trait he apparently shared with his mother. He was entranced by movies that involved helpless women trapped by serial killers, like The House of Wax, a 3D film which came out in 1953 when he was 8 years old. He found himself aroused by the fictional murders in the horror movies. This was a milestone in his sexual attraction to killing. Rader also seemingly developed a perverse sexual attraction to his mother. He masturbated into her undergarments. He was aroused when she beat him after his first nocturnal emission at age 10. Rader was also becoming increasingly obsessed with bondage. It's important to note that most people who practice BDSM or bondage are perfectly healthy individuals in their normal lives. Psychology professor Joe Magliano points out that partners who participate in BDSM often feel more connected with each other, and the BDSM provides stress relief. But Rader's love for bondage was intertwined with a disturbed desire to render his victims helpless and kill them. As a child, he also began sneaking off to isolated locations like the family barn and experimenting. This was both an extension of his obsession with bondage and a sign that Rader suffered from sexual masochism disorder. People with this disorder achieve sexual arousal by hurting and torturing themselves. Asphyxia is one of the most deadly types of sexual masochism. Sufferers like Rader will often hang themselves, breathe deadly fumes, or suffocate themselves to reach orgasm. Many accidentally kill themselves while engaging in this behavior. According to an article on the dangers of asphyxiophilia published in the National Library of Medicine in September 2016, anywhere from 250 to 1,000 people in the United States die each year from erotic asphyxiation. Author's note: in 23 years of police work, I had 3 of these types of runs. In the mid-1950s, when Rader was about 11 years old, he became a peeping Tom. He stalked his 5th grade teacher and climbed up a tree to spy on her while she was in the privacy of her own home. He brought ropes with him because he was contemplating sneaking into her house and binding her with them. Instead, he stayed in his tree and tied the ropes tightly around himself until he ejaculated. Rader also found enjoyment in being tied up by other children. He recalled an incident that occurred around 1957 when he was about 12 years old. After Rader and his friends snuck onto a farm, the kid who lived there led a group of bullies. He tied up Rader and his friends for trespassing. Rader explained, quote, "Being tied up and threatened like this aroused me," end quote. Also around age 12, he was turned on by a murder mystery story he'd read where a man strangled his girlfriend. Clearly, the mental link between helplessness, murder, and arousal was growing stronger with age. Rader was aware of the growing darkness within him, and he often referred to it as wearing the black hat, and apparently he understood it was something that needed to be hidden. He faithfully continued to attend his Lutheran church, and apparently hoping to quell the monster within him. Around 1957, when Rader was 12, he had a religious experience. He remembered, quote, "During one service, I felt the Holy Spirit move me. This enlightenment may have been a good spirit, a pivotal point in my life to become a church and Boy Scout leader and wear the white hat," end quote. Then in that moment, Rader decided to devote himself to being a good person. He wouldn't drink or smoke, and he wouldn't curse like the other kids. But he wasn't able to maintain his pledge for very long, and it's unclear if he really tried. Despite his insistence that he was a good Christian in his early adolescent years, he began to strangle and torture cats, paving the way for his gruesome murders to come. In 1959, Dennis Rader was a teenager living at his family's Wichita home. Part of him wanted to be a good Christian, but part of him was growing increasingly excited by thoughts of strangulation and murder. Rader attributed his ability to hide his murderous desires with his knack for compartmentalizing, which he referred to as cubing. He later recalled, quote, "I would do what I call cubing. It started in childhood as make-believe. Those white hat fantasies turned dark. They probably started before I can remember. I would cube into a storyteller for my brother, mostly at night. I cubed into a cowboy when we played. As I got darker fantasies, I cubed into a lone wolf. I spent endless time inventing my make-believe fort. As I grew up, the mental cubing was an escape from boring class or job. I found time to daydream each day because it was my best time. It also recharged me when I felt alone. My cubing made me feel better. It was easy to cube into the dark side of my secret. I wasn't hurting anyone, only in my mind," end quote. Over the course of 1957, Rader became increasingly obsessed with other serial killers. The 14-year-old found a magazine article about a serial killer named Harvey Glattman. It was in his father's car, and he couldn't take his eyes off the photos of Harvey's bound female victims. The women's despair and powerlessness were appealing to him. He wanted to be just like Glattman, tying up his female victims and killing them. Rader would spend the next several decades fantasizing about variations of this scenario. As psychology professor Louis Scheslinger explains, Rader was aroused by torture and murder. Quote, "It is very sexually stimulating for someone like Rader to control, dominate, torture, and then kill somebody else." End quote. In 1959, 14-year-old Rader was excited to learn about another pair of killers. On November 15th, he was riding in a car with a girl he had a crush on when he heard on the radio that 2 men had tied up 4 family members with ropes and then slaughtered them. Rader's immediate reaction was to wish that he could tie up the girl sitting next to him, a disturbing sign that he would eventually want to play out his dark fantasies in real life. That winter, Rader decided he needed to commit more exciting crimes. It was no longer enough for him to spy on the girls and women in his neighborhood. He needed to up the ante by stealing their belongings. Around the beginning of 1960, Rader broke into an elementary school and contemplated stealing things from a girl's desk, but he lost his nerve and left without taking anything. Rader started breaking into homes of female neighbors and stealing their stuff. He liked taking their stockings and masturbating with them. He began fantasizing about imprisoning women in secret barns and dungeons, and then torturing them and killing them. He had special imaginary torture rooms devoted to the pretty girls he felt he didn't have a chance with. He'd nicknamed these rooms DTPG, or Death to Pretty Girls. In 1960, 15-year-old Rader became obsessed with a cartoon segment called Dudley Do-Right on the Rocky and Bullwinkle cartoon show. Dudley was a Canadian police officer who had to keep rescuing his boss's daughter, Nell, after the villain had tied her to the railroad tracks. The cartoon represented the dueling aspects of Rader's personality. On the surface, he could pretend to be a sincere, religious young man, a good person like Dudley Do-Right, but secretly, he was the villain consumed by his desires to tie up women and kill them. In 1959, Rader began attending the Wichita Heights High School. He started working a part-time job at a welding shop to save up for a car. He struggled academically, but he wasn't particularly concerned about his poor grades. Catherine Ramsland suggested in her biopic on Rader that he may have suffered from a learning disability. More specifically, he may have been suffering with hypergraphilia, which involves an intense urge to constantly write and draw. Many sufferers are so consumed by this need to write that they scribble nonsense and draw constantly, thus stealing focus from his studies. We can't know for sure, though, if Rader had a disability. He's never been diagnosed with one. Although he faced difficulties with his school, Rader stayed active in his church. In 1960, 17-year-old Rader got into a bad car accident after he failed to navigate a curve and crashed his family's car while racing with other young church members. His head slammed into the windshield, and the broken glass cut his face open. He had to go to the hospital for stitches and missed a couple days of school. It's tempting to wonder if this head injury also contributed to Rader's murderous tendencies. But Rader was already killing animals, and he was fantasizing about tying up and murdering his female neighbors years before this accident. It's unlikely this accident was the key incident that led him down the dark path. Rader managed to graduate from high school in the spring of 1963, barely passing his classes. That summer, he bought a blue 1958 Ford for $800. That's over $6,000 in today's currency. He kept himself busy in the latter half of 1963, working at a family food place. His mother also worked there as a bookkeeper. When he could, he went out on dates with women. He enjoyed chatting with these women. He even found himself a primary girlfriend, while dating several other women on the side. By keeping himself occupied, Rader was able to somewhat tamp down his dark urges. He remembered, quote, "The dark side was not big at that time. I was too busy at work, and dating may have helped," end quote. But his darker urges couldn't be fully suppressed. He cut models out of advertisements and drew them tied up and bound in notebooks. He bought a book with a girl being strangled on the cover. He wanted to do more than just draw bound women. He wanted to tie up a real-life victim. But his busy social life didn't leave much time to indulge in these dark urges. Sometime in 1964, Rader moved out of his parents' house. He moved in with a roommate on North Carolina Street. His friend John was attending college, and he convinced Rader to give college a try. So Rader began attending college in 1965 when he was 20 years old. He continued working part-time and building what he called a hit kit, a collection of tools he would eventually use to murder his victims. But he was too preoccupied with college life to commit his first murder yet. Rader had been shy as a kid, but now he was constantly partying and going out with girls. But just like elementary and high school, he continued to struggle academically in college. Meanwhile, the U.S. military was drafting students who did poorly in school to fight in the Vietnam War. He knew his bad grades put him at risk of being drafted and fighting in the front lines of Vietnam. So he decided to avoid fighting by signing up for the Air Force in 1966. In August, Rader traveled to Lackland Air Force Base, where he began his military training. He continued to cut female models out of magazines and create bondage fantasies. His training was complete in the late 1960s. He shipped out to Okinawa, Japan. He snuck a .32 caliber Beretta with him when he was in Japan. He'd secretly take the gun with him into bars and clubs and imagine that he was James Bond. Unsurprisingly, he was already enamored with the idea of a double life. He had sex for the first time with a prostitute when he was 22. In 1967, he claimed he wasn't very good, so he hired a woman to teach him how to perform in bed. He continued to cut models and advertisements out while he was in Japan, but military life is a structured life, and it kept him occupied enough that he didn't feel a strong urge to kill. He remembered, quote, "Being busy seemed to stall the dark side. I received letters from my mother, which made me feel very good," end quote. In August of 1969, he learned about the Manson murders while he was still completing his military service in Japan. Even though he had idolized murderers as a teen, for some reason, he felt empathy for the Manson's victims, particularly the pregnant Sharon Tate. For a short time, this reduced his own desire to bind up women and murder them. Rader finished his military service in 1970 and went back to Wichita, Kansas. He began attending church again, and his mother set him up with a fellow member of the church, Paula Dietz. Rader later claimed that he was so in love with Paula, he temporarily lost all desire to kill. He said, quote, "In the fall of '70, I had little time or thoughts about the dark side. I was in love. You've heard the expression lovesick? That's how I felt," end quote. The pair dated for a few months before Rader proposed in January of 1971. Rader and Paula were married a few months later on May 22nd. But despite Rader's claim that he had suppressed his dark side, he was still collecting models from advertisements for his homemade bondage porn. He began sneaking off to an abandoned barn to strangle himself for his own sexual pleasure. In the spring of '71, he put together another hit kit, which he kept in his car. He didn't have a particular victim in mind yet, but he was ready to kill if the opportunity arose. He later said, quote, "The knife, guns, and hit kit were with me, so if an unlucky female had stopped, the murder spree would have started before 1974, end quote. Meanwhile, Rader played the happy husband to his new wife. They bought a home with a nice backyard in Park City. Rader got a job working at a Coleman plant, and then at the Cessna Aircraft Company. In 1973, everything seemed to be going well. Rader and Paul began to contemplate having kids, but Rader lost his job at Cessna in October of '73. He no longer had anything to keep him occupied. As Paula worked to support the two of them, Rader spent all of his time absorbed in his twisted fantasies of bondage and murder. He later recalled, quote, "I was home alone, depressed and mad at the world. I decided to go out and do something bad. With the loss of my job, my mind slipped into sex," end quote. He broke into a house on Old Manor Road that night and stole some tools. But breaking into homes wasn't enough to excite Rader anymore. He needed to escalate in his crime. Rader went searching for a potential victim. Sometime in the winter of '73, Rader attempted to kidnap a bank teller. Her comings and goings were predictable, making her an easy target. Rader stalked her, memorizing when she left the bank, and then attacked her as she got into her car. The woman struggled against Rader, and he gave up and ran. But he continued to use the bank where the teller worked, wearing dark sunglasses in the hope she wouldn't recognize him. His ploy was successful, and the teller never identified him. Since he had failed to kidnap and murder the bank teller, Rader began to search for new victims. That winter, Rader's wife had asked him to drive her to work at the Veterans Administration. She'd had a car accident before driving in the snow, and she didn't want to drive to work with snow on the ground. On one such snowy evening, Rader was driving his wife to work when he spotted a car on Murdoch Avenue. Inside the car was a Latin American woman and her 11-year-old daughter. Rader decided that this child would be his next PJ, or project, his code for the women and children he planned to kill. Rader derives sexual satisfaction out of murdering his victims of all ages, including young children. There's some debate whether Rader should be classified as a pedophile. While he did target an 11-year-old girl and later expressed regret that he missed out on opportunities to torture and kill other children, most of his victims were adult women. Author's note: in this author's opinion, he qualifies as a pedophile. Rader began stalking the young girl and her family. The 11-year-old girl's name was Josie. Josie was a sweet child and a stellar student who liked writing poetry. She adored her 3 other siblings, Charlie, 15, Danny, 14, and Carmen, 13, and she doted on her youngest brother, Joey, who was 9. When Rader stalked Josie in 1974, he called his new project the offensive nickname Little Mex. Ironically, the Oteros were from Puerto Rico. Josie's parents, Julie, 34, and Joe, 36, had moved the family around the country before Joe took a job as a flight instructor at Wichita. Even though there wasn't a lot of crime in Wichita, the Oteros took precautions to keep the family safe. Julie instructed her kids in judo, and they had a protective dog named Lucky. They had no idea they were being stalked by a budding serial killer. Determined to get past their defenses, Rader spent weeks memorizing their patterns, watching the Oteros come and go. On the morning of January 15th, he was ready to kill. His target was the 11-year-old girl, Josie. He planned to kidnap Josie and her mother and torture them both to death in an isolated location. He would later tell psychology professor Kathleen Ramsland that one of the reasons he targeted the little girl was because her address ended in a 3. He had an obsession with 3s and looked for them in everything. He noted, quote, "I'm partial to the number 3. I tried to pick houses with 3 or 6 in the number," end quote. According to psychology professor Susan Krauss, it's actually normal for humans to be obsessed with numbers and lists, which may explain why we think the number 7 is lucky. However, some people can develop an obsession with numbers that goes beyond the norm. Rader's belief the magical power of the number 3 was certainly out of the ordinary. He explained to Catherine Ramsland why he felt the number 3 was significant. He said, quote, "I first became aware of 3s in my life in my late 20s, but I've always had a tendency to do things in 3s, or multiples of 3s. I would try to buy 3 pairs of slacks, for example, or 3 of the same color of sock. Maybe it relates to the Bible, the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. The number 3 is mystical to me," end quote. Rader studied the Otero's morning routine. He knew that Joseph Otero always got in his car and drove to work at 8 in the morning. The eldest 3 children were also dropped off at school well before 8 a.m. By 8 in the morning, the only people in the house were Mother Julie and her 2 youngest children, 11-year-old Josie and 9-year-old Joey. Rader's plan was to murder the boy, tie up the mother and daughter, and take them to an abandoned farm where he could torture and kill them slowly. In early January, Rader bought supplies at a drugstore for his hit kit. He armed himself with a rope, window blind, cords, tape, a buck knife, and a .22 Colt pistol. By the middle of January, he was ready to strike. As January 15th dawned, Rader dressed for the cold in a hooded Air Force jacket and drove with the supplies over to the Otero home. He parked his Impala a few blocks away and crunched through the snow to Edgemore Drive. The Oteros were going about their normal morning routine. Joe Otero dropped his 3 children off at the school in his wife's station wagon. The family usually had 2 cars at their disposal, but Joe had gotten into a car accident recently and his car was in the shop. Julie began preparing lunches for her 2 youngest children, Josie and Joey. The children dressed for school. Josie put on a light blue shirt and Joey dressed colorfully in a yellow shirt with white striped purple pants. Joe returned to the house in the station wagon so his wife could drive Josie and Joey to school later that morning. Normally, Joe would have been driving to work at this point, but his recent car accident had left him with several cracked ribs. He planned to spend the day resting at home. Rader arrived at his victim's house at 8:20. He vaulted over the fence and cut the phone line so the victims wouldn't be able to call for help. He crept toward the back door, but it was locked. That's when he saw something that made him stop in his tracks. Fresh paw prints in the snow. Somehow, despite all the time stalking the family, Rader hadn't managed to figure out they owned a dog. Rader briefly considered running away and giving up. As he was debating what to do, the back door opened. 9-year-old Joey stood in the doorway, staring at Raider. Next to him was the beloved family dog, Lucky. Lucky barked at the intruder, and Raider was frightened by the dog. He needed to act quickly. He drew his gun on Joey and forced his way into the kitchen where he found Julie and Josie. Josie began to cry when she saw Raider's gun. Joe Otero was in the bedroom, but he ran to the kitchen when he heard his family's distress. Raider hadn't realized Joe was in the home. Now he was truly frightened. He figured he could handle both the mother and the 2 children, but he didn't know if he could subdue both adults. He decided the best way to handle everything was to convince them that he was just a wanted man and needed food and a getaway car. To make sure Joe and Julie didn't fight back, Radar engaged them in casual banter. He tried to persuade them that he was just an ordinary, relatively harmless thief. Both Otero and Radar had served in the Air Force, and they chatted about their military days. The Oteros didn't realize they were dealing with an aspiring serial killer. The term serial killer wasn't even a common phrase yet. Joe was initially convinced that his brother-in-law had hired Radar to play a tasteless joke on him, but then Radar showed Joe his gun, and the father realized this was really a home invasion. He told his family to cooperate with Radar. Joe likely hoped that if they all cooperated, Radar would take what he wanted and leave. Unfortunately, what Radar really wanted was to torture them. He was a psychopath who could fake empathy. Forensic psychiatrist Michael Wellner explains, while it's easy for Radar to dupe others, including his own victims, Wellner said, quote, "Psychopaths wear the mask of sanity. Nobody would have called Dennis Rader a psychopath before he got arrested. People who are true psychopaths really are cold and callous and lack empathy. They have a detached way of feeling emotion. If they exhibit emotion, it's an effort to create an impression." End quote. Rader was a psychopath who feigned emotions to manipulate his victims. All the kitchen banter that Radar engaged with the Oteros was just to make them drop their guard. Lucky continued to bark, which made Radar panic. He ordered the family to put the dog outside. He took the family into the parents' bedroom and tied them up with first aid tape. But the family found the bindings painful, so he redid the bindings with duct tape. This may not have actually been for charitable reasons. Rader later noted he found it especially arousing to tie up his victims with duct tape. Rader had learned to tie all different kinds of knots during his years in the Boy Scouts. He used so many different kinds of knots tying up the Oteros that police would later need to use an instruction manual to identify all of them. Next, he gagged all of his victims. Julie began to get nervous at this point and demanded to know what Rader's intentions were. Rader lied and promised that he'd call the police after he left, so someone would come and untie them. With all the family members tied up and gagged, Rader was ready to engage in his murderous fantasies. He wasn't interested in Joe Otero, so he decided to murder him first. This would get the most threatening member of the family out of the way. Rader strangled Joe Otero, and the father struggled against his bindings. He then beat Julie across the face and strangled her as well. Next, he choked 11-year-old Josie until she fell unconscious. Joey, the youngest, was sobbing at this point, so Rader put a bag over the little boy's head and prepared to kill him. But Julie and Joe had started to wake up. Rader hadn't strangled them effectively. Julie began to panic as she realized Rader was murdering her children, but Rader was unmoved. In fact, he likely enjoyed her watching her beg for her children's lives. Criminology professor Jack Levin explains why psychopathic killers like Rader get a thrill from hearing their victims beg. He notes that psychopaths are partially sexually oriented killers. Quote, "Enjoying the suffering of their victims, what makes them feel special and important, like big shots. The last thing they would want is to distance themselves. So, they typically, like Rader, use close-up personal methods to kill. Whether it's strangulation, stabbing, or bludgeoning, the kill is a mere footnote. The text has to do with the torture of the victim. Hearing her scream, pleading and begging for mercy makes the killer feel good." End quote. Rader strangled Julie again. This time he used a double hitch knot and placed a pillowcase over her head. Julie died. She was Rader's first victim. Rader killed Joe Otero next, strangling him with a belt. With the parents finally out of the way, Rader decided to take his time in slowly murdering the children. He picked up 9-year-old Joey Otero and dragged the boy from his parents' bedroom into the child's own bedroom. Rader placed t-shirts and plastic bags over Joey's head and tied a cord tightly around the child's neck until he couldn't breathe. Rader brought in a chair and placed it next to the boy. Police later found the chair's imprints on the bedroom floor and realized that Rader had wanted to watch as the child slowly suffocated to death. He enjoyed seeing the child suffer in his final moments. Rader later insisted this wasn't the case. He told Catherine Ramsland, quote, "The police report mentioned a chair that maybe I sat to watch him die, but that's not true. It could be that I placed it there to keep him still, while putting on the t-shirt and bag in place, or against the bed to keep him from rolling off. Many people think I tortured the Oteros and killed them in a sadistic way by reviving them, but the multiple strangle marks were there because I hadn't learned how to strangle quickly." End quote. We have to remember that Rader was a psychopath who spent 3 decades lying to everyone around him. While it may be true that he didn't know how to efficiently strangle someone yet, we do know that he found immense pleasure in torturing his victims. With the rest of the family dead, Rader was able to take his time killing 11-year-old Josie. The young girl was still laying unconscious in her parents' bedroom. Rader got her up, dragged her down into the basement, and hung Josie on a sewer pipe. As the young girl slowly strangled to death, he sexually assaulted her and ejaculated on her leg. It took less than 2 hours for Rader to murder all 4 family members. All he had to do now was clean up the crime scene. Rader had spent years reading detective novels and studying other serial killers. He figured he could use what he read and throw detectives off his trail. He cleaned up the crime scene and turned up the heat in the house, convinced this would obscure the time of death for the police. Then he took Otero's car and drove it to the nearby grocery store. He pulled up the seat before he abandoned it so police would look for a shorter killer. He walked his way back to his own Chevy Impala. That's when he realized he'd made a crucial mistake. He'd left his hunting knife behind at the crime scene. Rader rushed back into the house, where he managed to find the knife. He then drove home and settled right back into his normal routine. His wife had no idea that her church-going husband had just murdered 4 people. And this was just the start of Rader's dark path. Rader was initially terrified the police would figure out he was responsible for the Otero murders, but that fear soon turned to elation as the days passed and the police grew no closer to catching him. But the thrill that filled Rader after he successfully murdering the Oteros didn't last for long. He needed another fix. A few weeks after the January 15th murder of the Oteros, he began hunting a new victim. He spent every day stalking women, trying to decide on his next project. Sometime in February or March, Rader was taking his wife to lunch when he spotted a young blonde woman checking her mailbox on East 13th Street. She captivated him. He soon began to stalk her. He memorized her daily routine, pinpointing her vulnerabilities. She was a college student who lived alone, who'd be easy to overtake, and had a predictable schedule. She was the perfect target. By March, he'd made up his mind about Kathleen Bright. He would hide in her bedroom closet, bind her with rope, then play out any fantasy that crossed his twisted mind. This has been the Killer Bee True Crime Series, Episode 7, Part 1. Thank you for listening, and God bless.